very grateful to Professor Pat Naidoo, who is a member of the Engineering Academy, as well as the joint co-chair of ASSAf STEMI Standing Committee. That's the Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, and Innovation. And of course, given the fact that as we sit here today, I'm already in stage 5 load shedding since 10 o'clock, I suppose we are all experiencing the wrath of ESCOM's load shedding cycle. When I say wrath, I say it with kind of mixed meaning. I believe if it were not for that, we would all be much more in the dark as we currently are. And I will allow Professor Naidoo to introduce our speakers, because I'm sure they're going to tell us a lot more about how pumped storage hydropower can support the South African energy transition. I would just share a little story with you. I've just returned from India, and on Friday, I had the opportunity to visit the Sun Temple in Modera, which is about 2 hours away from Ahmedabad. And that entire community of about 4,000, which is a little village, is supported by solar power generated energy. And I mean, if you look at the transition of the community, the lifestyles, etc., it was really, really heartwarming to see how with interventions by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, that little community is completely powered by solar energy. So I'm sure the potential, given our position in the geographic grid, where we have a good source of solar energy, that these are opportunities for our country. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from the two colleagues who are going to share more on the topic to me. But for now, gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Pat Naidoo, who will then introduce our speakers and command the activities for today. So welcome to you all, and we look forward to a wonderful expose of scientific sharing of knowledge. Thank you, and over to you, Professor Naidoo.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Morning, colleagues, and thank you for your time this morning, and welcome to our joint session. My name is Pat Naidoo, and today I'm on voluntary duty at both the Academy of Science and the Academy of Engineering. And we are also co-hosting with the South African Institute of Civil Engineers. We are going to talk today in conversation around hydroelectricity, the potential of water to serve the national economy, in particular pump storage and its contribution to the stability and reliability of the national grid. We have a 3-part presentation. Part 1, fellow Mike Muller will present on pump storage basics, followed by Part 2, fellow Mike Shand will present on South Africa's Steenbras and Palmiet achievements. And then Part 3, fellow Mike Muller will return and take us on a journey of the future of hydroelectricity and the potential of water to serve the South African economy, and again noting the urgency of transition from a carbon-based economy to that of a clean energy economy. So let me invite Professor Mike Muller to present. And Professor Mike Muller is professor at the Wits School of Governance. He served as a National Planning Commissioner. He's also served as Director General of the Water and Sanitation Ministry of South Africa. Welcome, Professor Mike Muller. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. Naidoo. Let me see if I can share my screen. Always a good start if one can do it. There we go. How's that looking?
First class.
Okay, excellent. Well, good morning to everybody, and I'm glad that people have been able to join us, irrespective of stage 5. And let's hope that we stay on air long enough to finish the conversation. The focus this morning is very much on pumped storage hydropower and what it can do to support South Africa's energy transition. And we need to understand this because if we are to be successful, sorry, I'm having trouble now moving. There we go. We need to understand the question of storage as we move through this energy transition for reasons I'm going to explain. And this is particularly important because IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan 2023, is about to come out, as it's always about to come out. And it's going to be talking about issues that will very much affect this question. How much electricity storage do we need? Why, where, when, how much, what kind, who's going to provide it? And I'd like to suggest that the security and affordability of our future electricity supplies really needs us to make the right decisions at the right time and then to implement them. And let's hope this discussion helps to make that clear. 4 bullet points for this morning. I'll talk about pumped storage basics. We'll then look at pumped storage in South Africa, past and present, with Mike Shand talking particularly about the Palmiet, the Steenbras systems. And then I'll come back and talk about pumped storage in this energy transition and what kind of interventions are needed to support the transition that we're going through. So the basics. Why do we need to store electricity? How can it be stored? What are the alternatives? And very quickly, we need storage at the moment as it's a complementary option. It helps to support grid systems. That's today. Tomorrow, with far more intermittent and non-dispatchable sources, we're going to need it to manage the greater variability of those sources. And we'll depend on it also to provide a range of other grid services, which I'll come to. But the basic is clear. When we don't use much electricity, we use the surplus that comes from whatever generators we have to pump water up a hill. And when we need the power to meet peak demands, we let it out and it runs down and generates for us. Changes in the season, but that's the basic. You use the energy to pump up water when there's a surplus of generation in the system. And when you need extra generation, you let it out and you generate power. And the present role, and we can go in great detail, having storage in the system certainly helps to provide for peak supplies. It also helps tremendously to manage variability because we'll come to the relatively rapid response that pumped storage allows. All hydropower, and that includes pumped storage, can be tremendously helpful if there's a black start crisis. Let's hope it never happens. But if you need to restore operations after a really major network outage, having water in a reservoir able to generate electricity is tremendously useful. And then we need to recognize that just having these peak power flows means we can defer investment in the electricity supply system. The last point I'd like to mention is this idea of energy arbitrage. Storage does help us to smooth out the flow, particularly because third parties can purchase power in low price periods, resell it perhaps in high price periods, which also helps to reduce peak demands. And as we move into this sort of future of far more variable renewables, optimizing the balance between generation and demand, achieving real reliability, minimizing the need for curtailment of those renewables, and we'll come to that, is important. And part of this is actually just to keep the system costs stable and predictable. So how can electricity be stored? And, today we have to recognize we store most of our energy for electricity, not as electricity. We store it in other ways. But tomorrow, we're not going to be able to do that. We're going to rely much more on system elements. So let me just illustrate this. We look at the sources of energy for electricity at the moment, and that includes the full range, from oil and gas and coal through to liquid fuels, all that diesel we're burning. And of course, we can also use natural gas and the rest. The carriers of electricity include those liquid fuels, include the gas, include coal, and we use those to get the energy to end users. But, this is fine. We don't have a energy storage problem when we can put diesel in tanks. where we can put grain, which could be turned into biofuels, into silos. When we have mountains of coal, when we need to ramp up electricity generation, we just put more coal into the system. But the fact is that those storable energy carriers are not going to be acceptable in the future, in a low carbon future. We're not going to be able to use the carbon-based oil, gas, and coal. We're not going to be able to even use a lot of the biomass unless we're very clever about it. We're going to be restricted in what we can use to produce electricity, and also what we can use to carry it to the end users. And in the long run, electricity is going to be the main carrier, and perhaps, let's see, hydrogen will play a role in the future. So what are the limits for future electricity storage, and what are the options? Well, we know the options, batteries and all their varieties, including lithium, maybe green energy carriers like hydrogen, biofuels at the moment. The physical mechanisms, compressed air and flywheels, have always been talked about. But when we look at it, pumped storage is the dominant use at utility scale. And that's counting as megawatts, just the power it can generate, rather than total energy, megawatt hours, the amount of energy it can store. Because by megawatt hours, pumped storage really dominates. And if you look at the numbers, the global numbers, and I think this is IEA or US government collected global numbers, you see that pumped storage makes up sort of 90+% of the energy stored in electricity systems worldwide. Back in 2018, that might have been 1 or 2% shifted towards lithium, but pumped storage remains absolutely dominant as an electricity storage system. Are there alternatives to pumped storage? Yes, of course there are. We can invest in more generation, just have a lot of generation available at all times, which probably means that we overinvest in generation because a lot of it won't be used except in peak times. We can go into aggressive demand management. We're doing that already with load shedding. We can have punitive tariffs to match supply to demand, or we can try and link up with other systems, increase supply diversity. All of those things can be done, but that's not where we are just yet. So I do need to remind us that, we've actually got quite a lot of pumped storage in South Africa. It was set up originally to complement coal generation at Steenbras and at then Drakensberg and Palmiet and Ngula. Also set up to support water management at Steenbras, Palmiet and Drakensberg, and we'll talk about that. And to say that in the end, South Africa is actually already quite well served by pumped storage with power generation capacity of 3,000 megawatts and total energy stored of over 60,000 megawatt hours, implying that we've got about 20 hours of storage at that 3,000 megawatt power, which is not to be sneezed at, but it will not be enough in the future. So the present status, as we know, the system, we're in deficit with generation and reliability, huge challenges for system operators, growing proportion of intermittent renewables, which is not making life easier. And what we're seeing is that pumped storage is already supporting structured supply restrictions. It's providing flexibility and dispatchability that's critical to fill the gaps. And when you look at the gemors, if I may use the Afrikaans, of the peak requirements, you can see the little blue circles. That's where pumped storage is being turned on and turned off and used to supplement and make sure that whatever the level of load shedding we're at, we're able to sustain it more or less reliably. So it's being used very tactically, and we're very happy for that. So let me now hand over to my fellow colleague, Dr. Mike Shand, who will talk about quite how Palmiet and Steenbras in the Western Cape are really contributing to this process. So over to you, Mike. Mike 2.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Prof. Muller. Let me welcome Professor Mike Shand to come on board and share with us the deep experience at Palmiet and Steenbras. Over to Mike Shand.
The topic of my talk is the Steenbras and Palmiet pumped storage schemes. The Steenbras being the first such scheme in South Africa. It is owned and operated by the City of Cape Town. Next slide, please. As Mike Muller stated, it's the way that pump storage is utilized both for pumping and for generation is reflected by the Eskom tariffs, which I would like to deal with in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Tariffs are lower. This Eskom's tariffs are lower during the low demand periods when surplus base load power is available. The purpose of this is to encourage use of power by large users. And pump storage schemes are operated to deliver water from the lower reservoirs to the upper reservoirs during this period. Eskom's tariffs are high during high and peak demand periods, when peak power is also provided by expensive gas turbines. These high tariffs discourage the use of power, and during that period, pump storage schemes are used to generate power by releasing water from the upper reservoirs to the lower reservoirs. Next slide, please. This slide shows the Eskom Megaflex tariff structure. This particularly shows the time of use periods. The green periods marked the outer ring are the weekdays, the second ring are Saturdays, and the inner ring is Sundays. And the green area shows when power is available. The red areas show when the peak demand periods occur during those particular days. For example, peak demand, which is when pump storage is used to generate, is from 7 to 10 in the morning in the low demand season, and from 6 to 8 p.m. In weekdays. I think and the high demand season is fairly similar. Next slide, please. This slide shows the tariff. Just at the very bottom of the slide, you'll see that during the peak demand season, Eskom's tariff, including, it's very difficult to read, is 2.94 rand during the peak demand period, whereas it's only 42.5 cents during the off-peak period. And during the low demand season, which is the September to May period, it's 84 or 94 cents per kilowatt hour during the peak period, and about 37 cents per kilowatt hour during the off-peak period. Next slide, please. This is the actual repeating of the numbers that I've just spoken about. Peak power is almost 3 rand per kilowatt hour during the high demand season, and just over 40 cents per kilowatt hour during the off-peak period. And during the low demand season, it's very much reduced, 96 cents during the peak period and about 42 cents off-peak. Next slide, please. Just then to talk about the City of Cape Town Steenbras Pump Storage Scheme, which was the first such scheme in South Africa, and Eskom's Palmiet Pump Storage Scheme. Next slide, please. This slide shows the location of those schemes. They both serve water supply to Cape Town. The Palmiet Pump Storage Scheme actually is part of the transfer scheme of water from the Palmiet River, Kogelberg Dam on the Palmiet River, via Rockview Dam into the Upper Steenbras Dam. And the Upper Steenbras Dam, which is part of the City of Cape Town's Steenbras Pump Storage Scheme, is also a storage reservoir for the City of Cape Town's water supply system. Next slide, please. Just to show the two pump storage schemes in a Google Earth image and where they are located. Next slide, please. Now to speak about the City of Cape Town Steenbras Pump Storage Scheme. Next slide, please. As I said, the City of Cape Town Pump Storage Scheme comprises the Upper Steenbras Upper Dam, which also supplies water to Cape Town, and then the lower dam of the pump storage scheme, which is just close to Gordons Bay. Next slide, please. This is a 180 megawatt scheme. It comprises 4 by 45 megawatt reversible Kaplan turbines. It was originally operated in conjunction with the city's Athlone power station to supply peak demands. And prior to load shedding, it was operated to minimize the cost of power purchased from Eskom, pumping during off-peak tariff periods, which I spoke about earlier, and generating during peak tariff periods. Today, it is also being used to some extent to minimize the impact of load shedding. Next slide, please. It also benefits water supply. The upper dam stores water to augment the supply to Cape Town. Initially, water for Cape Town was released via the lower Steenbras Dam, which is the first remote water supply for Cape Town. And since the Fora water treatment works, and then it was treated by the Steenbras water treatment works. And since the Fora water treated works was commissioned in 1994, water has been pumped by the Furlands pump station from the lower dam of the pump storage scheme to the Fora water treatment works. Next slide, please. This shows a cross-section of the pump storage scheme, the upper reservoir, the low pressure tunnel, the surge shaft, and then the high pressure tunnel and steel conduit and steel penstock, the pump storage, the pump storage scheme or the turbine generators themselves, and the lower reservoir. Next slide. Just a view of the power station itself, comprising 4 45 megawatt reversible Kaplan turbines. Next slide, please. Eskom's Palmiet Pump Storage Scheme in the Department of Water Affairs and Sanitation's Kogelberg and Rockview Dam. The scheme is jointly, basically, the dam components are owned and operated by the Department of Water and Sanitation, and the pump storage scheme by Eskom. Department of Water and Sanitation requests or advises Eskom when water should be transferred. And Eskom then accommodates that as within its operating cycle as best it can. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As I showed earlier, the Palmiet pump storage scheme is on the right, comprising the Koelgeberg Dam, Rockview Dam, and the pump storage scheme itself. Next slide, please. So Eskom comprises two 200 megawatt reversible Kaplan turbines, i.e. if it's a 400 megawatt station. The penstock comprises a concrete lined low pressure tunnel and then the high pressure steel penstock itself. It's 2 kilometers long. During the winter months, flows in excess of the ecological flow requirements of the Palmiet River are pumped and then released to the Steenbras Upper Dam. These ecological flow requirements of the Palmiet River are very important because the river flows through the Palmiet Bioreserve, which has been declared as by UNESCO as a bioreserve. The ecological flow requirements of the estuary are also important. So this has played quite a significant role in the amount of water that could be transferred by the pump storage scheme, and it must be released to the river. Next slide, please. Then moving to just the Steenbras again, pump storage scheme. Next slide, please. Just talking about Eskom's pump storage scheme was commissioned in 1986. Eskom operates the pump storage scheme in conjunction with the Koeberg, particularly the Koeberg nuclear power station and the power transmission from Mpumalanga to generate during peak demand periods and to pump during the low power demand periods. And the Department of Water Affairs determines when the water should be transferred from the Koelgeberg Dam, as I mentioned earlier, which depends on the flows, the ecological flows for both the Palmiet River and the estuary. Next slide, please. Then conclusions. The City of Cape Town's 180 megawatt Steenbras pump storage scheme was commissioned in 1979. That's now 44 years ago. It's normally utilized to minimize the cost of purchasing power from Eskom during peak tariff periods. And it is currently also used to mitigate the impacts of load shedding on Cape Town's users. Next slide, please. Eskom's 400 megawatt Palmiet pump storage was commissioned in 1988, 35 years ago, and is operated in conjunction with Eskom's Koeberg nuclear power station and the electricity transmission from Mpumalanga. It's currently also used to mitigate the impacts of load shedding, and it is also important for supplying water to Cape Town by transferring water from the Palmiet River to the city's Upper Steenbras Dam. Next slide, please. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, fellow Mike Shand. An excellent summary of the experience to date. Let me hand over to Professor Mike Muller. Mike, take us on to part 3, the future of hydro as an energy carrier for South Africa. Over to Mike.
Are we doing, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, 100%.
Okay, excellent. And now this, of course, gets to the exciting part. You know, the old part, pump storage, was a very and is a very well-established technology, a very useful technology. But we're going into difficult and different times. And the question is, how is pumped storage going to feature during this energy transition, and what's going to happen? And thanks to everyone for the questions. I see you've anticipated rather a lot of the things I'm going to say, which is always the best place for a speaker to be. So let me kind of proceed and if the machine will play well. We do need to acknowledge that the role of storage in electricity system, certainly in South Africa, has already changed. Instead of just essentially pumping when we have got cheap energy and generating when it's more expensive, the systems are being used in a much more flexible and problem-oriented manner, helping to manage the instability of old generators and the variability of new sources. We're already in the new world. And the question is, we're going to have to transit to new roles and address future challenges, but keeping in mind that we need a system of electricity in South Africa that's technically and financially stable, but also the energy must be reliable, accessible, and affordable. We've got to do the job well. We can't afford to make mistakes with essentially the energy system of the country. And as part of this, we're going to need a regulatory framework for energy storage, which clarifies everybody's roles, the roles of energy users, private service providers, as well as the grid operators, protecting the public interest and mobilizing the private initiative. And I confess, when I remembered about what the ISMO was, I looked at all this list of things that have to happen, and I was wondering, can the ISMO really manage this big gizmo, the Independent System and Market Operator, which I believe is now going to be called the National Transmission Company of South Africa? I much preferred ISMO because it rhymes with gizmo. The questions we need to ask: why do we need more storage? And if we need it, what kind? Who's going to pay? And who's going to pay how much? And who's going to do what in the new system? This is still open territory. And, we look forward to IRP 2023 and see whether it begins to give some answers. And the need for more electricity storage is very, very obvious. As you get into more and more intensive or large-scale renewable-driven systems, you need more storage to manage their variability. And the current experience provides some insight into these challenges. Looking at the graph of how the peak, the top of the load is currently being built up. The brown is the coal, and above that is the nuclear, and then the imported hydro, and then you get into the pumped storage and the gas and the renewables. And that mixture is going to be what we have to sustain, and pumped storage or some form of electricity storage is going to play a useful part in that. And as I say, at the moment, the renewables and storage are just the icing on the cake. Imagine, and I'm not saying it's going to look like this, but imagine a renewable heavy future where that current top slice of the cake is now the whole cake. And now we have to regulate the supply coming from all of these different sources. And if we think that we can do that without storage, we're probably dreaming. So we need to ask the question, what kind of storage will be needed? And we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that energy storage is only going to happen at the grid scale. Well, of course, we won't make that mistake because so many people are now worried about how they can assure their electricity supply. And we're all looking at what we would need to do to provide ourselves with a sustainable electricity supply. And very often we have to go and buy a battery to be charged by a solar panel, and it costs a lot of money. But there's a portfolio of technologies that's going to be required, different purposes at different scales for different players. So at grid scale, we really need storage to provide system reliability and security. The actors who are providing the renewable energy need some way of increasing the dispatchability of that energy they're producing, because if they can actually produce it when it's needed, as opposed to when the sun shines, they can sell it for a lot more money apart from anything else. And then the individual users, we're trying to back up against a very unreliable power system, and we're trying to manage our costs. So different parties have different purposes and objectives, and they'll use different technologies for those. So when we start talking about choosing the technology for these different kinds of storage, it must be fit for purpose and cost efficient. And, here we're talking mainly about the utility scale, but peak shifting is important, managing daily and weekly variability, meeting particular needs of users, but then also looking at the other grid services, keeping the grid stable, which is important. And fundamentally, because this is South Africa in 2023, we really have to look quite carefully at the broader development objectives that the country is trying to achieve and ask ourselves the question, how does this storage solution help to achieve those broader development objectives? And if we're going to contribute to just energy transition objectives, this is all political stuff now, we really need to do social and economic assessments of each technology, do the financial analysis, work out what kind of financial and regulatory instruments are needed, and then we can begin to provide resilience to make sure the system can deal with all of the unpredictable stresses it might find. And I put here already the headline finding from most of the literature is that lithium-ion batteries at grid utility scale, and somebody asked the question, BESS, what's battery, blah, 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 I can never remember what BESS stands for. Certainly lithium for short-term storage is currently looking like the dominant storage system for utilities. Pumped storage, on the other hand, is way in the lead for anything that requires longer duration than 4 hours. But let's look into that a bit further. This came from one of the US research institutes looking at the cost of electricity storage technologies currently and going through to 2040. And this really demonstrates the dominance in 2020, the current sort of situation of pumped storage. No matter how many discharges you are going to use per year, if you want more than 2 hours of storage, pumped storage has been best, and it will be good up to 16, essentially up to 4 days worth of storage. And particularly if you're going to switch it on and off very frequently, it is probably the best form of large scale energy storage. Yes, maybe hydrogen will come in, and maybe I forget what the green is. The green is compressed air, which is interesting. And in the longer term, 2040, which is how they looking at deciding what will be used in 2050, hydrogen could well come in that longer term, and lithium could become better in the shorter term. But that's just looking at the cost of storage, and it's not looking at all the other associated costs and benefits of a technology choice. So showing you this again in greater detail, I believe the slides will be available, and the references, I've tried to put the key references into the presentation. You'll be able to see them when you need to. I do need to say that there's other perspectives, and there are some people who say at the moment that actually lithium-based storage, the 2 hour storage really doesn't justify its costs in terms of making large-scale deployment. I think there's people already proving that wrong and making money out of it, but it is interesting that this was the US Argonne National Laboratory saying storage resources with 10 hours storage capacity are delivering value already consistent with the cost of pumped hydro storage. But they emphasize storage isn't needed if you've got a diverse mix of flexible low carbon power sources, and that could include flexible nuclear power. I notice they don't mention traditional hydropower, which is actually the way that most countries which are already well advanced down the renewable path have actually achieved storage and stability of supply in a green fashion. And this is why one needs to now talk about what else pumped storage can do other than generate reasonably cheaply, having stored energy reasonably efficiently. It can respond rapidly. It can help to regulate voltage and frequency in grid systems. The black start capability is critical, and because it's a longer duration type of storage, it is resilient to HILP challenges, high impact, low probability challenges, the kind of things that can close down a grid if you don't have some system in place to avoid that. And these are services that are not all provided by the shorter duration technologies, and they're certainly not adequately accounted for in the integrated supply systems of organizations like Eskom, which simply puts in all of these functions and doesn't necessarily identify value and fund them separately. But we're going to have to do that because we're unbundling the system. And now all of the components of that system have to be identified, valued, and somebody's got to pay for them. So who's going to pay and how much? And we better just recognize that society and the users are going to carry the costs, which is why it's so important for us to get the technology choice right. The challenge is to ensure that we get a cost-effective system for all users. We've got to have a fair allocation of costs between users. Users have got to be protected from unpredictable price variations. All of those ancillary grid functions have got to be supported somehow. And we've got to remember that there are wider social and economic benefits involved when you start building an entire country's energy system again. What is that going to mean for the country and its economy and its people? And that's why we have to recognize that the value of electricity changes it all through the day. It's, in some automated markets, the value of electricity, the price that you have to pay for a certain amount of electricity varies literally minute by minute. And at the moment, there's a bit of a gold rush for energy arbitrage. What can we do to buy when it's cheap and plentiful and sell when the demand grows or the supply falls? And a number of not just companies, but countries, the Norwegians are laughing at the moment because they're well connected to the European market. They have a lot of hydropower available. When Europe goes dark, the Norwegians open the taps and the water goes one way and the dollars and euros come back the other. What we find with pump storage is it helps to moderate the volatility, which might be bad news for the arbitrageurs, but is good news because it might for the rest of the public, because it can enable infrastructure savings, it can reduce costs to users, as well as all the other ancillary services that it provides. But it is very difficult to quantify and cost and fund these benefits. And just a couple of pictures, just to show how electricity prices, even in a well-developed market like Germany, vary through the day and then vary hour by hour. You can see there's money to be made if the cost of your energy varies from €0 per megawatt hour on a Sunday and goes up to 60 euros per megawatt hour by Tuesday. There's good business there. And anyone who thinks that there's stability, just look at how these different European energy systems vary in price from 30 euros per megawatt hour in some systems up to 120, 130 euros per megawatt hour. Imagine trying to run a business with that kind of variation. And this question of the high impact, low probability events, yes, we don't expect them. But boy, when they happen, do they cause havoc? And this is what happened when the Ukraine war started, and you saw the European electricity markets go up 5 times in price, not 5%, but 5 times the price over a couple of months, just because a small war started and a gas supply was interrupted. Keeps coming back to the story. How do we value pumped storage properly? Whether it's the US Department of Energy saying it's difficult to do it, it hasn't been done very well. If it's the Chileans, who are very good at this, by the way, saying, how wrong can these planning models be to get it so badly wrong? And Caroline van Dongen and her colleagues down in Stellenbosch saying, the way that the modeling was done here in South Africa, public pump storage was disadvantaged because it wasn't properly monetized and recognized in the software that we used to do the modeling. So it's a difficult business. And It's made more difficult because we don't know what the institutional arrangements are going to look like, or know what they're supposed to look like, but will they function as well as they should? We know that Eskom is going to retain a big role as a generator, but there's a lot of private generators who are going to come in and aim to increase the value of their output. And us as electricity users, whether it's individuals or institutions, are going to have to adapt and adopt new approaches. And here comes the challenge again. Can this independent supply organization manage this complex organization? And can NERSA really nurture, sorry, I'm playing with the words again, the necessary new arrangements? The most critical is who's going to ensure that in this complicated process, these complicated institutions we've set up, we ensure that just transition benefits are achieved. We really need thoughtful policy, effectively implemented. And actually, you don't hear too much of that in the political discussion at the moment. It's one of the reasons for having this workshop. Who's going to be doing what? Storage needs to be regulated to protect system benefits, allocate risks and remedies, and particularly to balance the trading benefits that private providers are going to gain with the system resilience objectives that the public wants and needs. And then also, we have to consider who's going to take the decisions on the impact of our choices of energy storage on the local just transition. For example, are we going to invest in imported equipment, the batteries and the panels and the rest of it, or are we going to turn to local construction? And here we need to recognize that if we want to go the local route, we have rather a lot of potential pumped storage sites in South Africa. Back in the day, Eskom had identified 90 potential sites. They filtered out a bunch of them, looked at the top 7. Braamhoek, which is now called Ngula, has been built, but a couple of others are there and certainly could be developed when and if we want them. Question is, will we do so? And then you look at the criteria that were used to identify these. Is there water available? Funnily enough, Ngula Braamhoek was the one where the water was potentially most problematic. They've resolved it. There's siltation risks. Steelpoort, which is up where the De Hoop Dam is on the Olifants River system, was identified as being very serious as a siltation risk. But since we've built the dam, which was subsequent to this review, the siltation risk's been reduced. And it's interesting that Steelpoort, and I mention this because it's coming through as a very strong option for the next pumped storage system in South Africa. I forget what it's called again, and Pat Naidoo will remind me in a moment. But it scored very highly, but in the end, Ngula Braamhoek was chosen. And that was for a variety of reasons, and just goes to show, just because something comes up as the best possible technical system doesn't mean to say it's the right one to proceed with. But when we compare pumped storage with the alternatives, batteries and inverters, I was horrified to see the figures that came out recently, and I've put the source of them down below there, that in the 3 months, which would have been April to June, South Africa spent 16 billion rand importing batteries. And that's in addition to about 15 billion importing panels and inverters. Now, that's an awful lot of money for the country to send out and not do anything locally except put them on roofs and generate some electricity. And that essentially is the choice. We're going to have to choose between pumped storage, at least more pumped storage, and batteries, or at least not quite using batteries for everything. That's probably the big developmental choice that has to be made. It's difficult to make these choices. And, you know, everyone who looks in this domain, and I've been doing quite a lot of work trying to understand how different countries are handling this. People are saying things, I love the Swiss, uncertainty will be certain. We know that it's going to be difficult to make decisions, and particularly long-term decisions like building pumped storage, because those kind of investments take a long time, they have high capital costs, long construction, and require a long payback period. But it's not just about energy. We've got to look, and they call it the social net present value of projects. How do we assess the benefit for the wider society of one set of energy storage technologies against another set? So that's the challenge we're going to have to face. What kind of storage are we going to adopt? Who's going to pay for which bits of it? And what are the criteria we're going to use to decide what kind of storage we want in our future energy system? And that's going to involve looking at the local content and its benefits versus the imports, and particularly the development impact of the storage option chosen at different investment locations. And we do need to remember that this is going to have to happen quite often. It's been a relatively stable winter, but it was interesting. There were a 4-day period of very cloudy, very still, where the renewable energy system that Eskom currently has in place, its production dropped by 50%. Too many of those 50% without enough storage really threatens the stability of the system and our ability to keep our economy working in the way we would like it to do. And so the key messages, as I draw to a conclusion, comes out of that. It's very tempting to just say, well, just put in a few more batteries every time you put in a few more wind turbines, and we will sort of incrementally increase storage as we increase generation. And the problem with that, those batteries cost a lot more per unit of energy stored than the pumped storage. So we're placing a burden on the public sector, and we might be crowding out local economic opportunity by doing the quick and easy incremental buying of batteries instead of building system storage in the country. Obviously, smaller interventions are attractive for private funders. You know, the unit cost looks good. You're going to get a return quite quickly, especially while the system's unstable. You're going to be able to make some money buying cheap and selling expensive, but the overall system-wide cost will be higher. There'll be limited domestic economic spin-off, and you'll crowd out the larger strategic HILP, the high impact, low probability interventions that actually then will become more expensive and less viable in the future because a lot of storage will already be in place. And we also do have to recognize, and it's already being noticed, that if you have lots of small energy storage systems, and we see this with the municipal load shedding, when they put a zone on, now that there's so many batteries and geysers all connected to the grid, and they've all been running cold or running empty during a load shedding period, when they all come back, there's a reconnection surge, and quite often the lights go off again. And it's concerning too that this opportunity for energy arbitrage might prioritize private profit over public good. These are the kind of things we need to regulate and think hard about how to manage. So the key message is maybe start now. We've first got to recognize that storage is going to become very important as the transition to renewables and their intermittent and variable renewables proceeds. Certainly they need to be, the storage must be in place as we expand solar and wind. And we must recognize the value of the other services it supplies, the security it offers, to have more storage and longer term storage rather than just the minimum short-term peak shifting storage. But we need the framework to fund and regulate this accordingly. So we need to choose the right technology in the right place for the right purpose. And it looks like the optimum, yes, we'll carry on importing batteries for short-term load shifting, even if we are importing them and getting very little local benefit from them. But for anything that requires long duration storage, and that includes system stability, we really do need to think about pumped storage. Trouble is, pumped storage takes time. We need to plan, we need to implement, and we need to commission. And if we don't start now, we'll find yet again, as has just happened with the transmission, oh, we can't build more wind turbines because we forgot we're going to need grid connections. We'll find we can't use as much energy as we should be through solar and wind because we haven't got the storage to back them up in place in time. So the message is we really have to start now taking decisions about system storage. And it's just as serious as how we generate and how we transmit the energy. So I hope that's a helpful start to the discussion. And I hope we've got enough time to have some discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Muller. Excellent, excellent presentation. Colleagues, thank you very much. And the chat is very, very busy. We've got a good attendance. There's 123 of us. And we'll commence with the discussions going forward. Fellow Mike Shen, may you join us also? And Prof. Himla, you're also joining us. Please come on board and switch on your cameras. In terms of the discussions going forward, we'll go through the chats and try and work through the questions that have been posted. But Ms. Raj and I have been noting a very busy site, as in a few colleagues that have put on quite a few questions. So maybe you should also join us in conversation. And we might have to possibly see how best we could technically bring you on board. So to Neil Armitage, Michelle Rivarola, let me start with you two. If you would like to join us, if you could maybe raise your hands, and then we'll get an indication of your interest to talk through some of your questions, and then we could pick up the discussion from there. Shall we try that? I'm going to check for your hands. Or also open to anyone on the floor. I just identified those two sites as busy question site. Neil has got his hands raised. Michelle also got her hands raised. Very good. Please join us. Please join us. Ms. Raj, would you be able to facilitate their entrance onto the chat? Very good. We're going live with the chat now. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, I believe they will be able to unmute themselves now.
Yeah, you have been given access. Neil and Michelle, please join us, and then we'll pick up the others shortly. Let's start with Neil first. Neil, in case you go on to load shedding, let's work through your questions and comments. Over to Neil.
Are they able to unmute themselves?
Yes, you'll be able to. You've been given access. Try, Neil. Michelle, you try.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go
Yes.
for it, Neil.
Okay, no, sorry, I got nailed by exactly the problem, load shedding. So load shedding cut me out just as we were talking. No, I mean, I'm quite happy to participate. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, I see Michelle is here as well. So there's been a lot of conversation, as one can see, between whether there are alternatives to pumped storage like batteries and all the rest of it. So, I mean, I'm talking mainly as a professor in water engineering, but I don't have the day-to-day figures. It just seems to me that and again, the point's been made by Mike Muller, that in terms of the scale that you can achieve your pumped storage scheme, it's very difficult to achieve anything at the moment with any alternative battery system. It's not only about your peak, your megawatts, but it's also about how long you can do that for. Now, I must admit, I've already learned quite a lot about one or two options that I didn't know already. But it is interesting. I suppose the big question is, which was raised in the chat, was batteries are getting better all the time. Will there come a point in time where they can be competitive? I don't think they're competitive at the moment, but then again, we're talking about a 10-year lead period, I'd imagine, to get a decent sized pumped storage scheme in position. So I guess then maybe Mike can add into this. Is there any sort of sense of where we will be in terms of battery technology in 10 years' time that might make them competitive to a pumped storage scheme that comes on board, which now is no longer competitive? And we've seen this already in loads of power generation, how the figures are changing very fast.
How do you want to take this, Pat? Do you want to go question by question, or do you want to take a couple? I can answer quite quickly on this one, but then we better decide. So let me just say, thanks for the question, Neil. I think, and that's why I use those figures from the USA. They certainly are seeing the battery role growing quite significantly in the future. I think that was before people started panicking about how much battery material electric cars are going to use. Because if you're going to choose between building an electric car and putting a battery in it, or building a storage system for grid utility, you'd rather supply 1,000 cars than you would supply one power storage unit. So those figures are interesting, but I think you're correct to identify that as an issue. That's why I think the local development impact will be as important as the choice of technology, because I think the costs are going to be fairly comparable, and we'll have to make choices based on a range of other criteria as well.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe Michelle has got would have a comment here.
Yeah, she's open. I can see. Michelle, go for it. If you wait.
Yeah, sorry. I think that battery storage at the moment, you're seeing a solution which is in its infancy. And there is just about something new every day. One thing that is not being considered when you talk about battery storage is how much storage is available in electric vehicles. And, with bidirectional chargers coming more common now in a lot of the countries where EV vehicles are fairly diffuse, that has changed the model completely, because now you have a battery in a motor car which can be used as a storage system to smooth out peaks. Mm-hmm. But for me, if I look at the amount of money that is being invested in the United States alone on research on battery and storage technologies which are not related to pump storage, because pump storage is a fairly old technology. It's an old concept. I just think that batteries in 10 years' time, you might find the battery the size of your fingernail will be able to satisfy the demands of your household. So one needs to look at, are you going to invest now for something that you're going to benefit in 10 years' time, or are you going to accept the fact that maybe South Africa is not going to be a technology leader, it's just going to be a technology follower and a technology implementer? And take what comes from overseas.
Yeah. If I can come back to that, Pat, and Mike Shan, please interrupt if I'm talking too much. The reason I use the technology reviews from places like USA and Switzerland, I think, is because I agree with you. There's a danger of technology overtaking. But given the amount of excitement, that the energy storage is kind of raising all over the world, I think that we can be fairly sure that we can see the development curve emerging. The Financial Times this morning has got a big headline about how China is over-investing in battery production. They want to do for batteries like they're doing for solar cells. But we've got to remember that the big drive for batteries is actually for vehicles. And yes, well, maybe we can connect in all the future fleet of vehicles into the grid. But realistically, we're going to want something perhaps more stable. And that's why I say we're not going to have one technology rather than another. I think we're going to have a suite of technologies, and the longer duration, slightly more conventional and reliable, is going to have an important role to play. So I take your point, but I think the jury is out. And certainly saying that there's going to be a role for longer term storage into the future. The question then is, people say, well, what about hydrogen? And, hydrogen might also be a competitor. And I think we'll find that we're in all of these spaces at the same time. There will be a suite of solutions, and I don't think putting in a couple of thousand megawatts of storage is going to be a wrong decision at this point.
I just want to pick up this something. I mean, the car story I've heard before, but it concerns me that, in theory, yes, of course, you can link everybody's electric cars, assuming we even have them in South Africa, because at this stage, we're a very long way from having a major fleet of electric cars. But, of course, it's the demand for electricity might not suit the demand for people to actually drive their cars with a full battery. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily a smart move. But I think, Mike, you've also raised the issue that there could very well be a bit of a crunch on the materials required for these batteries, which could limit the amount. And one of the things I've learned from observing the aviation industry about particularly hydrogen is this concept of energy density as well. That hydrogen is a useful way of transporting energy, but it's difficult to contain. It's explosive under certain conditions, and certainly we seem to be a long way away from hydrogen being used even in the aviation industry, which is the one that's most likely to adopt it in terms of energy for powering aircraft, in this case, to get away from fuel. So lots of different options, I'm sure, but it comes back to your basic tenet, which I agree with, is that we're looking for a large amount of storage, particularly for industry, for example, where they may not have an access to the kind of energy storage that we may be able to get away with in a house. So at a household level, perhaps we can get off grid with our, not off grid, we can solve the problems with our batteries and non-inverters at a cost, I might add, which is not, of course, affordable from a large majority of the citizens. But when it comes about power for the masses, it's hard to see an alternative at this stage.
No, thank you, Neil. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I think that was a good conversation, and certainly the principle sustains in diversity, we have strength, right? Let's hold that one at that point. Let me bring in fellow Andres Ntetwa and his question, the capacity of pump storage that is planned for South Africa. And Mike Muller, you had alluded to this earlier. I think it's to do with De Hoop, Steelpoort, and the Tubatsi 1500 megawatt pump storage. Tubatsi, yeah. That's the name. And it's in the Limpopo province.
The first thing you forget. The first thing you forget with age is the names of things and people. The reason for putting up the map, which identified the top 7 of the 90 sites that Eskom had identified back in a decade ago, was to point out that pumped storage is actually quite easy to find sites for. Whether you can find really good sites is another matter. But they have identified 90. They whittled that down to 7. Of the 7 they looked out, they ruled out the one at Mutali in the far north of Limpopo, because they said when they went and looked, the rock conditions weren't very good. But there's plenty of other options. Tubatsi is just the one which was well prepared by Eskom, and because of that, it could probably be run into implementation quite quickly, because I know a lot of prep work was done with that. And we also have to consider, one of the reasons prep work was done with Tubatsi is that there are water supply problems in that region. And I must confess an interest, as a Department of Water person, I was very hopeful that Eskom would help to pump a little bit of water up to Sekekuni, which is desperately short of water sources. And, a 1% of their pumping would actually have been very useful to supply water into Sekekuni. So I do think that there are, across the country, a range of opportunities where that kind of opportunity could arise. But Pat, there was questions earlier about alternative forms of storage. Someone said mass storage. Can you just put loads of rocks onto a hoist and pump, lift them up and down? And those kind of options are possible. And I know our mining industry is very keen on looking at them. Whether they provide the scale and the cost efficiency of a pumped storage dam They certainly wouldn't provide a water transfer opportunity, but there are a lot of other technical options. What I found interesting about the scan that's been done in a couple of places is that many of those simply fell off as not being really meeting the needs at a cost-effective and cost-efficient rate. But I don't know what else we had on the chat. There was quite a few, and I'm just trying to find a nasty feeling I might have been load shed.
Are you there, Mike?
Load shedding. I need to switch.
You there, Mike?
Yeah,
Load
Mike, we can hear you. But
Oh, can you hear?
yeah,
Okay,
we can.
I seem to have lost quite a
thank
lot
you.
of my
Thank you, Mike.
screens. I
Mike,
can't
can you
see.
talk a little bit about the round trip efficiency of pump storage? There are a few questions around.
I thought those round trip efficiencies were answered. I saw somebody put a 77%, which sounds about right. You know, obviously it depends a little bit on your system, but I think we must be careful to not to make the mistake of looking terribly hard at efficiencies, because one of the things, and I think it came out in Mike Shan's presentation, you know, the low value, the low demand price for energy can be very low compared to the high demand price for energy. So, you know, if your energy is going to cost 5 times more and you are only 75% efficient, you're still making a lot of useful return. And I think whether it's on the storage technology or the particular approach chosen, I think that the price differential is the driver. And you know, as long as you're not throwing away most of your energy, you'll be okay. I mean, hydrogen, everyone is saying, is not going to be competitive because it's actually quite inefficient. Yeah, it's inefficient, but you can store it and you can transport it and you can use it and it's green and you can generate it using solar. Well, you know, I don't care if it's 50% efficient. If it can do all of those things, it's probably a good bargain. So that's why, you know, I think we're converging into this sort of area where we can see the batteries role, we can see hydrogen's role, we can see a pumped storage role, and little bits and pieces in between.
Thank you. To Mike Shand and also Mike Muller, there's been talk of using or repurposing the old mine shafts for pump storage duty. Your thoughts on that, the practicality thereof?
I'm not an expert on mine shafts, but I would think that they would be relatively small schemes. I think they have been used on a trial basis by the mines themselves, but your storage is probably your limitation. So sure, as small schemes, they probably could be effective. Mike Muller may know more about it. Mike?
Yeah, look, I've looked with interest and I can see why people are interested. They've got all these old mines. They'd like to find something to do with them. But there are two questions aside from what you're saying about the limited capacity. I do worry about pumping water up and down through our gold mines. You know, Joburg's been shaken up a bit over the last year or so by sort of underground activity, not seismic activity, but just old mining activity. So it doesn't seem too clever to run the water up and down every day. It's a very good way of weakening the existing geology. And of course, we also do have the other problem of mobilizing the acid mine drainage, which I would far prefer to leave at the bottom of the mine and not activate further. So although it sounds interesting, I think we could find lots of other solutions if we're just looking for a convenient space with a top and a bottom and some storage, than those mines. I don't know if there's any mining people on the call. I'd be very curious to hear their comments on it, but I'm not sure that it's going to really work for us.
Now, you make valid points there around acid mine drainage and the geological stability of the area itself. Very valid points. Thank you for that, Mike. Colleagues, I think we've exhausted the question and the themes that ran through them. We're at the point now we close on to 12:19. We've got 10 more minutes on our scheduled time. If there's anything you would like to raise further, Mike Shan, Mike Muller, or two presenters, and then on to Prof. Himla from ASSAf, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything. I think the discussion has been valuable and we've covered a number of points. And I'd particularly like to thank Mike Muller and yourself, Pat, for putting this together and for Mike's very, very comprehensive presentation. Thanks, Mike. I learned a lot.
Well,
Thank you, Mike.
Could I thank us for the opportunity then? Because I've been wanting to get into this ever since we tried to promote the Hoop as a pumped storage system. So, I'm glad the argument is still running. And quite seriously, I do believe that we've made mistakes in the country around forgetting about transmission for too long. And I think it would be quite useful, and I hope this conversation helps to raise the profile of storage again. And I hope the participants will add their voices to saying, not you have to build pump storage, but can we please think about storage and not forget about pump storage? Because I object to sending so many billions of rand across the seas to buy batteries. But thanks very much, and thanks to those for attending, and to ASSAf and SAAE for putting it on.
Sorry, Pat,
Thank you, Prof.
One more thing, please.
Please do.
One must, if you're dealing with pump storage, please take into account that it takes 10 to 15 years to implement such a scheme. The environmental approvals can take the appointment of consultants for environmental approvals, and the environmental investigation may take 3 to 4 years. The appointment of maybe a consultant for a feasibility, and that is another 3 to 4 years. The actual design may again take 3 to 4 years. So you're talking 15 to 20 years to get a pump storage scheme operational. So one must be very careful of, be aware of that, and be very careful of actually the implications that has.
No, thank you. Fully agree with that. Fully agree. Colleagues, as we wrap up, I want to reflect on a presentation that was made by the chairman of State Grid Corporation of China. It was at a global forum on energy transition, and chairman had put on the table 3 points that he wanted the People's Republic to embrace and for State Grid to pursue. The first point was to deepen electricity as the national carrier of energy. Connect everything and electrify everything was his mode. Second was to strengthen transmission. Strengthen transmission to be adaptable and flexible to accommodate all the energy resources that will come its way, both dispatchable and intermittent. And his third point was build pump storage. And he made the point that China currently has 38 gigawatts of pump storage in operation. They have 45 gigawatts under construction, and they would achieve almost 100 gigawatts by 2030. And he placed a lot of emphasis on pump storage. And I think there's something we can take out of the Chinese experience and try and bring same to South and to Southern Africa. Let me at this point bring on Prof. Himla, our Executive Director at ASSAf, to say a few concluding remarks. Prof. Himla, could you join us?
Thank you, Professor Naidoo.
Thank you.
Well, it's really been a treat to listen to Prof. Muller and Prof. Shand share with us their insights into this whole concept of pumping of energy and how it features in the South African landscape. I must confess that I knew very little about it. I know a little bit more, and it has whetted my appetite to learn a little bit more to try to understand where we are in South Africa in this whole issue. We are all users of electricity. We are all people who are subjected to the woes of electricity. And at the recent BRICS summit that we hosted, we heard of 11 MOUs signed between South Africa and China, many of these related to energy. ASSAf also has a Just Transition Forum, and within that forum, we try to address issues pertaining to the just transition, how we advance our position with respect to alternate energy or greener technologies, but at the same time giving consideration to the plight of humans who would be subjected to the changing, transitioning from current day coal to cleaner renewable energies. Because if we see how human settlements are set up, we have family systems all around areas that provide, coal-based energy utility. So the human factor is also a huge consideration. So is the issue of upskilling of people who would have to transition from the one to the next phase. So it is a major, major challenge. And during the conversation we've had today, we heard that it is also a bit of a political situation. So be it as it may, it is our responsibility as leading academics from both the Academy of Science of South Africa and of course from the South African Academy of Engineering to have a voice, to utilize the, the intellectual capacity of both academies to put these points with respect to advocacy to the fora who are responsible for the decision-making and the policy advancements, etc. So, so that is my plea, not just to our speakers, but to also those individuals who are participants from the various academies and other stakeholders included. We are here to support anything that you would want to present to the policymakers so that we can have a voice in the shaping of a better society and a better economy for all of us. So on that note, I first and foremost wish to thank Professor Naidoo for his duality from both academies and for bringing us these esteemed colleagues who helped share their insights unstintingly with us, and to the participants who have had a very, very active engagement on the chat. It was very, very nice to see. And with that, I wish to thank you all on behalf of both of our academies for your engagement, and hopefully, Pat, we could have something similar
Correct, the next one.
In the near future so that we don't lose the momentum of these very, very
Yes.
interesting issues. So with that, colleagues, I want to say a hearty thank you to all concerned, and of course to my colleague Raj Mahabir, who has been coordinating all of this on behalf of us, and to Helene Duffy, who also supports the Academy. Thank you, Chair, and all the best to one and all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Himla. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to all the attendees. We'll close the webinar now and say goodbye to all. Take care and stay well. Thank you and bye-bye.